In this tutorial we're going to have a look at adding flexibility to a component. So in this particular instance we're going to look at a metal clip component that would be produced to have a tab on one end. So you can see this one has a tab on one of the ends, and then when this component gets assembled, the intention in this case would be that this component is made out of brass, and it will be pushed down into a plastic housing and then clip in place, and then the tab that was used to help the user handle the component is then twisted off. So the tab is removed in the final assembly state of this component. So what adding flexibility into the Creo part allows you to do is essentially save two copies of the component in two different states, but inside a single part file. So you don't have to create a copy of your part file with the tab missing, and then another copy of your part file with the tab intact. You can save these two states within this same flexible part. Another thing that varies in this particular instance is this 60-degree dimension. So that dimension there, which is that 60 degrees, which is the sort of angle of these upright faces of the part. Now the reason in this case that you would want to vary those is that as this piece of brass, spring-loaded piece of brass, is pushed down into its housing, into the plastic housing that it gets assembled into, the plastic housing slightly compresses the part. So the metal itself is elastically deformed by the housing. So this 60 degrees has a free dimension when it's just been produced, and then it has an assembled dimension as well, which will be a little bit tighter of an angle. So part flexibility or component flexibility allows you to store these changes to the component inside the actual part file itself. So what we're going to do is just you need to set your working directory into the listed folder there, subfolder, and then you need to load up the assembly file that the components the tutorial's calling for. So here's the assembly file that it's calling for you to load in. You can see at this point the assembly file just contains a single part, which is this brass sprung component that we're going to work on. So in order to add flexibility to a part, you need to be in the assembly that has the part included, and then go to the file menu, go to prepare, go into model properties. Now there's many options that are available in here. Within model properties you can change things like the units, the material that the part's made out of. But one of the options, if you look down here, is flexible, and we can see currently flexibility has not been defined. So what we're going to do is click on change there, and that brings us into the flexibility tool here. Now the system's requesting some input from us. We can see that because there's an input box here, and if we look down at the left hand side we can see select dimension owner feature please. So what we're going to do first is we're going to collect that 60-degree dimension that I was talking about earlier. So we're in the dimensions tab of the flexibility feature, which means that when we click on geometry within our part, so I'm just going to click on the part here, certain dimensions that we use to create that part become visible. So you can see all the major governing dimensions that we use to create this part are actually visible now. Now if we want to edit a dimension that's not currently shown, so you can see here there's no current dimension shown that relate to the size and shape of this tab. So what it might be useful to do is browse down inside the part, and then what we can do is start clicking on features. So you can see I can zoom in on certain features within this part and get the governing dimensions that we use to set up that particular feature. You can also see that this part's been modelled with a group folder, so two features here are being grouped together within a group folder. But again, I can browse down into these individual features and click on them, and I get the governing dimensions that we use to create that feature visible. Now, as we've already said, the only dimension that we want to make flexible within this particular part is the 60-degree dimension that's governing the angle of this leg of our part. So I know that's included in the first feature there, the extrude one. So there it is, the 60 degrees. If I now click on that to select it, you can see it highlights in green, and then click on this little plus icon here. I've now collected that dimension. So that's been collected as part of the flexibility feature. And what that means is when I come to insert this part in any assembly from now on, I will have the option of varying that dimension before I insert the part. So the system will let me, for example, increase that 60 degrees to 90 degrees, let's say. So that's one method that you can add flexibility to a part. You can vary the dimensions that govern the shape of the part. Another way that you can add flexibility is you can switch features within the part on or off. So you can see I've now selected the features tab, and what this allows me to do is make this tab area of the part active or inactive, depending on how I'd like this component to be represented in the assembly that I'm putting it in. So the way that this part was modelled, I've already said that the features relating to this tab have been packaged inside a group. Now that's not strictly necessary. I could select these features separately if they were just in the feature tree, just as normal features, that would be fine. But it's quite nice that they've been added to that group. So if I click on the group, there's a feature, and click on the add icon again, you can see that feature has now, or those features have now been collected and added to my flexibility setup. So basically what I can do with those features is I can either switch them on or switch them off, depending on how I want this part to be represented in the assembly that I'm putting it in. So that's the flexibility for this part setup. We're going to allow the user to vary the 60-degree dimension, and we're also going to give them the option of being able to switch on or switch off the presence of this tab area up here as well. So we've set our flexibility up for this particular component. So we'll click on OK there, just as a check, just to check that that has actually worked. What we can do now in our model properties window is, rather than changing the flexibility, we can browse within it. So if we click that down arrow there, we can see that we get a table here telling us the options that we've included in that flexibility feature. So we included a one dimension that can be varied within that flexibility feature, and one feature which the group itself is classed as the feature. So one feature has been included in that flexibility feature as well. So in the next bit of this tutorial, we're going to look at what those setup steps that we've just done would actually achieve when you came to use this component in an assembly. So what would the interface look like when we were given the option to vary these two bits of flexibility that we've added into this component. So for the next section in the tutorial, which is this section here, even though we're going to be using a copy of this particular component that we just set up, it's had a few of the changes made to it. So what you need to do is you need to close down that component that we were just working on, go to erase not displayed, because obviously that component is still being held in memory and you need to flush it from memory, or erase it from memory. So we'll click on OK, then we'll set our working directory to the folder that's been outlined here. So flexible placing is where we should be working now. So there it is. And then we'll load in the assembly that it's calling for here. So it's placing flex assembly. So once we've loaded this new assembly in, this should be what we're looking at. And so what this is the housing into which the little metal clip that we were just looking at gets placed. So this is obviously a connector of some kind for some electrical pin to be pushed into, so that you get an electrical connection between our clip, which is a metal component, and some kind of pin that is the other side of this connection. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to place one of the clip components into this assembly and see what the flexibility that has been saved within that clip allows us to do when we're placing it within an assembly. So we're going to go assemble. It's called the flex contact, the component that we were working on. So there it is, flex contact. Open, and then the system sees that the component that we're trying to bring in has already had some flexibility defined within the part itself, and it's saying, would you like to use that flexibility when you bring this component in? Yes is the answer. So what that does is it momentarily pauses the constraint actions that you would normally do when you bring a component in. You would constrain it within the assembly, so you can see all that menu's grayed out, and it drops us into the flexibility menu instead. So just as we did when we looked at the example of this, this copy of the clip, or this copy of the flex contact, has had exactly the same two areas made flexible. So the 60-degree angle is there, and what the system's asking is, would you like to use the default 60 for that angle, or would you like to enter another value? So in this case, I know that when these clips are constrained within this assembly, the shape of the plastic, so you can see the shape of the inside of the housing there, forces the clip to adopt a 90-degree angle. So I'm going to put 90 degrees, so just type 90 into that box there, hit enter. Then what I'm going to do is go into the features tab, because I also know that there's some flexibility being added to this part, just as we did in the last tutorial, where this entire tab can be switched on or off. And the thought is, in this assembly, is that once this tab's been installed, the user will then just twist this tab, and the tab will shear across that surface there, because the tab's no longer required. The tab is only there on this design to allow the user to easily handle this part when they're inserting it into the housing. So the only options that I've got here, this isn't a dimension flexibility feature, it's just whether I want these features switched on or whether I want to switch them off. and the terms that the system uses for switching features on or switching them off is they are either resumed, as they are at the moment, or suppressed. So suppressed is turning them off essentially. It gives me a warning. I'm just going to say yes to that warning, and then I'm going to click on OK because I've defined all the flexibility options that I want to change about this part. So I'm going to click on OK, and then I'm back to constraining this just as I would normally. The one thing to note here is that this component also has had some component interfaces saved within it. So you can see if you don't know what component interfaces are, I suggest you watch the other video entitled Creo Component Interfaces that is included in this PDF that we're working from, this Advanced Assemblies PDF. And the component interfaces within this part have been set up so that when you bring it into an assembly, the first piece of geometry that gets referenced is this cylindrical bottom face. So I'm going to now constrain that relative to that cylindrical bottom face on the block. And then the next reference for my component interface that's been stored within this clip part is this flat face on the end of the clip. So I'm going to make sure that that's coincident with that internal face there. And then the last one is a component interface reference which has been set up with this green top face of the clip, and it's been set to a parallel constraint. So I'm just going to click on that top face of the body here, and then that clip should be fully constrained now. So you can see fully constrained is in the readout, so I'm going to click on OK. And then the last thing that we're going to do, again, we're utilizing component interfaces that have already been set up within these two parts. So the block itself also has some component interfaces saved within it. And if I now click on the contact and click on the pattern option, because of the way the block has been set up and its component interfaces, it has had its component interfaces patterned along with the actual slot shape itself. So you can see these four highlighted sort of spot icons are showing me where the pattern members of my clip are going to be created. So unless I want to switch one of these off, which I can by just clicking on one of these, that switches it off. Click on it and it switches it back on again. So I'm just going to click on OK, and I get my four pattern members patterned using that component interface pattern that's stored within the block. So the last little bit of functionality that we're going to have a look at here is we're just going to open this clip up in isolation. So if you click on a copy of it and then click on open, and what we're going to do is we're just going to look at how, if I was to vary one of the governing dimensions of this clip, so I'm just looking at the dimensions that are stored within extrude 1, maybe if I change that value, which is currently 4, to something significantly different, so 8 will do. And then this is just in a way to prove that when I make an edit to this, it not only updates this version of the part that has the 60 degree in there and has the tab present, but it also edits the flexible version of the part. So the version that we've put in our assembly also gets affected by these changes. So if we just go back to our assembly window there, now nothing's changed at the moment, but that's because we've not regenerated this assembly. So in order to regenerate it, I'm just going to click on that little button there, or Control and G is the keyboard shortcut, and you can see those initial sort of tab sections lengthen because they've now been set at 8mm. So any change that I make to geometry in here, as long as it's not a change within a feature that's been suppressed, so as long as it's not a change within the tab in this case, those changes will run through into our slightly modified flexible version that we've placed within our assembly. So that's essentially flexibility for components within Creo. We've looked at the setup steps, how you would set flexibility up. We've looked at some of the things that you can do with it. You can vary dimensions when you bring a component into an assembly, or you can turn whole features on or off, or to use the correct terminology, you can set whole features to be resumed or suppressed. And that's just a menu that will pop up at your request as you go to place a component within an assembly. So you can model one component but have multiple versions of it within an assembly.